Now, what if I told you that Stalin's foreign policy was a triumph and a disaster at the same time? From the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, an unholy alliance between the Nazis and the Soviets, to the disastrous creation of Magnitogorsk, I will rate the Soviets' foreign policy and make a judgment at the end, deciding whether it was a success or a failure.
So the three main figures of the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1941 were Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, and each of them had different views on foreign policy. So when the USSR was first established, the leader was Vladimir Lenin, who was driven by the global communist revolution and the pragmatic diplomacy. He established the Comintern in 1919 to spread communism, such as Germany in 1923. However, this failed, forcing a shift in diplomatic recognition. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the Treaty of Rapallo were both treaties signed with Germany, the former addressing Russia's withdrawal from World War I, and the latter discussing recognition and economic cooperation. Trotsky promoted permanent revolution, aggressively supporting communist movements such as the previously stated one in Germany. However, in 1924, when Lenin passed away, Stalin emerged victorious out of the power struggle and became the leader of the USSR for the rest of the period up until 1941. So Stalin's foreign policy focused on security, industrial growth, and survival. He industrialized the USSR through his 5-year plans and sometimes copied Western models such as Magnitogorsk from Pittsburgh and Gary in the United States. He balanced diplomacy with the Nazis in the West, such as joining the League of Nations in 1934 and the Franco-Soviet Treaty in 1935, but then switching to the Nazis with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, dividing Eastern Europe with Nazi Germany. However, Hitler's invasion of the USSR in 1941 forced Stalin to rejoin the Allies, showing the inconsistencies in Stalin's strategies.
Stalin's aims can be simplified into 4 key points, with this SCIS acronym I have made, which stands for Security, Communist Expansion, Industrialization, and Survival. So after the death of Lenin, Stalin took power in the Soviet Union. His foreign policies were driven by weakness and insecurity, shaping his efforts to prevent invasions and strengthen defense. Yes, I wonder how that went. Leninist theory viewed wars as a tool of capitalist imperialism and an opportunity for revolution. Stalin, however, saw war as an existential threat rather than a revolutionary catalyst. However, despite being anti-imperialist in rhetoric, Stalin often engaged in wars such as the Winter War and the Partition of Poland, shifting from Lenin's vision of global communist insurrection. Communist expansion remained a key objective, as seen in the formation of the Chinese Communist Party, which was inspired by the Russian Revolution. Mongolia transitioned to communism, being the second ever country in 1924 and the first Asian country to become communist. And the Spanish Civil War was a war between the Spanish nationalists and the communists, which the communists eventually lost, but they still managed to spread their influence to other parts of Europe. While Stalin initially promoted the spread of communism, he shifted to his socialism one country policy, where expansion took a state-driven rather than a revolutionary approach. For example, he supported the Chinese Communist Party, but also backed the nationalists at times, showing inconsistencies of Stalin's views of communism. He also sent aid to the communists in Spain, but this was more because he just wanted to weaken the fascists in Spain rather than just aiding them because they were communist. Stalin pursued 3 5-year plans between 1928 and 1941, and they reflected Stalin's belief in dialectical materialism and historical progress towards socialism. The first plan involved rapid industrialization and collectivization of farms, meaning that the country's peasant farms had to join state-controlled collective farms, called kolkhozes. Initially, the 5-year plan ordered to collectivize 20% of the sown area to state-controlled farms, which increased to 60% from 1929 to 1930 due to widespread famine. The second 5-year plan continued with industrial growth, significantly increasing steel, coal, and electricity production. And the third plan shifted towards armaments production, however this was cut short by the Nazi invasion of the USSR. Leading up to the Second World War, Stalin faced a diplomatic challenge, balancing relations between Nazi Germany and Western powers such as Britain and France to ensure their survival. Stalin feared German aggression, leading him to shift alliances based on Soviet interests. The first alignment under Stalin was with the West, as Stalin joined the League of Nations as an alliance against fascism, but he contradicted the Marxist rejection of Western capitalist institutions. He also turned toward mutual assistance treaties, such as the Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance to counter the rise of Hitler. After failed negotiations with Britain and France and fear of Nazi aggression, Stalin turned to Hitler to sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, dividing Eastern Europe such as the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, and the split of Poland. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact shocked communist movements worldwide, forcing Stalin to justify cooperation with fascists as a necessary evil. While this did buy the Soviets time for preparation, they still ended up getting invaded by the Nazis in 1941, forcing the USSR to switch back to the Allied side for the rest of the war. In this section, I'll rate 4 components of the Soviet foreign policy on a scale from 1 to 10. For the sake of simplicity, let's just make a passing grade 20 out of 40. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact gave the USSR time to strengthen its military and expand its territory. It initially allowed Stalin to avoid a two-front war, as the USSR was also worried about another war with Japan, and this just might be because of what happened the last time they were at war. This one should be obvious, yeah? So basically, Stalin misjudged Hitler's intention and ignored intelligence reporting planned invasions. The betrayal also caught them lacking, leading to massive losses early on in the war. And it didn't help that Finland also humiliated them recently in the Winter War. So while the pact temporarily benefited the USSR, it ultimately failed to prevent war, leaving them desperate for their allies' help. I'll give this one a 4 out of 10. Under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the USSR expanded westward, taking eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania and Finland. This expanded their influence, which later led to most of these countries becoming communist after World War II, and they also gained access to resources from those countries. The Soviet army was humiliated in the Winter War, showing weaknesses in the Red Army. While they did conquer land from Finland, it wasn't without heavy casualties. This expansion heightened tensions with the West, and they were lucky that the West helped them in Operation Barbarossa. So while the USSR managed to expand their territory and secure influence, they faced resistance, especially from Finland, who humiliated them, and it did cost many resources to expand. Unlike the pact with Nazi Germany, it didn't put the USSR in severe danger, and just for that, it goes off a point, getting 6 out of 10. The Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance showed an attempt at collective security against Nazi Germany. Maxim Litvinov, the Commissar of Foreign Affairs, was the driving force behind the USSR during the League of Nations, marking a shift to cooperate with Western powers. The Franco-Soviet Treaty lacked explicit military coordination, making it ineffective. The League of Nations was weak, failing to stop Hitler's aggression. It also didn't help that the USSR was kicked out of the League of Nations for invading Finland. So the USSR's alliances with the West were highly ineffective, as neither side really trusted each other that much, and these failed alliances pushed Stalin to ally with Nazi Germany, and we all know how that ended. So yeah, Stalin's Western alliances get a 3 out of 10. The replication of Pittsburgh and Gary helped develop a steel-producing center. Soviet planners did this, bringing in American engineers and specialists to accelerate industrialization. By the late 1930s, Magnitogorsk was a key supplier of steel and iron, crucial for Stalin's 5-year plans at World War II production, as it was safely behind Soviet lines. However, Magnitogorsk was not all the sunshine and rainbows that Stalin had claimed. Unlike the American cities it was modeled after, Magnitogorsk lacked proper housing, infrastructure, and worker safety, leading to poor living standards. Stalin often used Gulag prisoners to work in Magnitogorsk, and while it was cheap labor, the work done was often reliable, such as a canal built by the workers not being deep enough to fit ships, and factories that had to be rebuilt over as they were not deemed safe enough for the workers. Magnitogorsk successfully industrialized using American models, but its effectiveness was limited due to poor planning, harsh conditions, and forced labor. However, it still gets a 6 out of 10, as we are mainly focusing on foreign policy, not the conditions within the country. Well, tallied up, Stalin's foreign policy totals to a score of 19 out of 40, which is unfortunately 1 point of a pass. So what does that mean? Well, that means that overall, Stalin's foreign policies were unsuccessful.
So while they did end up victorious in the Second World War, and in their territorial and influential expansion, it didn't come without a cost. They ultimately failed to prevent war, leaving the USSR vulnerable, as we saw in Operation Barbarossa. They also failed to secure lasting alliances, which with ties with the West coming to a halt, ultimately leading to what will be known as the Cold War. Thank you for watching.